Hello, and welcome to today's edition of Geostrategy in Action, a video series in which we explore how companies around the world are adapting their operations and their strategies to key geopolitical developments. So I'm Courtney Rickert McCaffrey. I'm the EY Global Geostrategy Insights Leader. And today we're going to dive into how the mining and metals sector is managing the current geopolitical environment. So this is the second in a series of episodes in which we're exploring how geopolitics is really affecting a specific sector and how organizations in that sector are adapting to continue to position for growth in the future. So I'm really pleased today to welcome Grant Mitchell. He's an EY Parthenon strategy partner who focuses on helping clients in the mining and metals sector. So he's the perfect person to be speaking to about all this because he's got a front row seat to what's happening. So excited to get his thoughts on what he's seeing in this space. So Grant, because we've seen over the past few years that, of course, the mining and metals sector seems to be becoming increasingly important to geopolitical competition. Particularly via trade policies, but also various industrial policies and different types of resource nationalism in different countries. This does feel different, but at the same time, not entirely new. So I guess, my first question to you is it true that geopolitical risks have really been rising in mining and metals, or what's different this time from previous dynamics?
Yeah. Hi, Courtney. Look, I think maybe one of the things to sort of start with is that actually EY surveys hundreds of mining and metals executives every year, and this sort of concept of geopolitical risk has risen in that survey in importance in 4 out of the last 5 years. And so at least in the minds of people who are in the industry, it has been getting sort of more prominent. And I think it's hard to avoid conversations about geopolitics in boardrooms at the moment. The latest survey shows that importance has sort of plateaued a little bit. And so there's an argument, of course, that now risk has been priced in. But it's still hard to avoid. I think it's worth reflecting that, most of the mining and metals commodities are natural resources, and that the meaning of that's sort of lost over time. But if it's a valuable thing in a particular geography, then obviously geopolitics, follows closely behind. And I think, it's natural to always be there. There are a few new factors at present. The biggest one that I would say that's new is that there's now a realization that security and growth actually are both aspects of mining and metals. And I think before people have started to think, well, it's actually a growth-oriented industry, but now there's this new security lens. There's also other new things as well, which is because of the way demand has grown for some metals, in a sense, exploration has not quite caught up. And so supply is much more concentrated as well. And that's given people more opportunities to try and compete in new ways. And maybe the third factor is that even though vertical integration has been central to mining and metals for decades, I think there's now a view that some parts of vertical integration and some ways of vertically integrating mining and metals values chains are less welcome than they have been in the past. And so a lot of the sort of turbulence you're talking about there comes from this confluence of new factors, a lot of which are, maybe the last decade, increasingly prominent.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you laid out those 3 new factors in the current geopolitical environment. And especially your point about kind of governments seeing metals as important to both security and economic growth really strikes me as particularly important and maybe particularly novel, especially because it's part of this broader shift, right, that we've seen governments around the world really embracing economic security, even putting those 2 words together. And that's kind of the defining policy agenda in so many capitals around the world right now.
Yeah, and I think that it is this idea that, I guess multilateralism is being replaced by something that's more about security and more about sovereignty.
Next question maybe is, when you look at how policymakers, the media, and analysts are talking about the sector, what do you think is missing in a lot of the current commentary about mining and metals and geopolitics?
Yeah, a lot of the current commentary, the news flow is about events, things that have just happened. And I guess, Courtney, that's fair enough, and that's how a lot of the sort of the journals and media is set up. But there's ways in which you can think a little bit differently to make that reporting and that news flow part of an approach that's a little bit more tractable. And so there's a few ideas here. One is it's helpful to be deliberately global about geopolitical analysis in mining and metals. So for most of the commodities we're talking about here, the supply side really is global. And so if you get distracted on one area or one player at any one time, and you ignore changes in Africa or changes in South America, then in a sense you're not getting a fully rounded picture of really important assets with global significance. Another thing is it's helpful to separate geopolitical events about the time that you think they're going to take to execute, and also the time over which you think they're going to have impact. And so we'll probably come to tariffs in a moment, but I think that's a really important exercise when you're thinking about what do I do with a tariff announcement? What's its half-life? And how does it lead to a longer-term event? And then I think one of the things is that the news flow focuses on sort of glamorous metals, if you like, rare earths, explicitly critical minerals. But there's a lot of geopolitical relevance to just things that have always been important and are going to be increasingly important. Copper, bauxite, iron ore. In a way, those commodities are increasingly globalizing, or at least not getting any less global. So again, making sure that you think about all of the periodic table, if you want to think about it that way, is also really important.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it. And I completely agree from the geopolitical perspective of needing to take that more holistic view of the sources of political risk that are affecting the sector. Much of the commentary focuses on geopolitical tensions, as you noted, and competition for resources. But of course, as you pointed out, country level political and policy and regulatory dynamics are really important as well. Both in the countries that have the metals and mineral resources, as well as the big consumer markets, which brings me to the U.S., of course. And you just mentioned tariffs. I do have a question on that. Tariffs have obviously been a really key geopolitical risk this year. So how should mining and metals leaders think about this year's tariff changes? And how are you seeing companies adapt to this new international trading system?
Yeah, so it's a bit like, again, there's echoes of the conversation we just had, Courtney. So we're helping a lot of people deal with what you might call the sort of immediate or maybe even tactical aspects of tariffs. It's easy to underestimate just the pure kind of compliance and the pure sort of basically restructuring that's needed for even what amounts to sort of simple, albeit quite novel tariff changes. But I think it's also, again, useful just to think about tariffs in what they mean in a slightly broader sense. Obviously, they're designed to affect cross-border flows of goods, but they're also part of trade policy that is intended to influence competitiveness, if you like, and the flow of capital as well as the flow of talent. And there's also two other things that they're signals of. One is they cause changes in the perception of the viability of different capital flows and different types of business models. And obviously, Courtney, as you know more than I, they're signs of a shift in a long-term geopolitical sort of environment. And so the thing about thinking about tariffs in that broader context is probably making sure you understand where your value is created in a geographic sense. And that's not always where your operations are. What policy environment are you exposed to? Where does your cash come from in a sort of a tariff policy sense? That's a really interesting map to make for a lot of companies. And probably the only other thing is I'd say is, in a way, there's an interesting future exercise, which is to say, what do I think the equilibrium position of global tariffs is? If I think about the signals that are being sent by individual tariff changes, where does the equilibrium wash out? What does game theory tell me about how tariffs are being deployed? And then how can I use that sort of equilibrium thinking to say, well, actually, in the medium term, am I positioned in a way for a world that probably will have longer and higher tariffs for an extended duration?
It's a really important point about thinking sort of medium to long term in addition to those short term tactical issues. So I think, looking out that over those longer time horizons, how are you seeing mining and metals companies really integrate a lot of these geopolitical parameters, whether it's tariffs or other shifts in the geopolitical system, into their global supply and demand models. So are they using scenario planning, thinking through a range of potential outcomes? What are you seeing?
So I think there's a combination, Courtney. The challenge here is, as we often talk about, is to make geopolitics useful as well as interesting. And if you sort of leap to a fully fledged kind of geopolitical wargaming sort of approach, which some clients are doing, then you are faced with this challenge of saying, well, that's great, but how do I put it into my analytic framework? And so there's a few ways of sort of getting started if you want to think about it that way. One is to take a really important decision, or one that's emblematic of the sort of decisions that you feel you're going to have to make over the next few years, and say, what would happen if I thought about that? How would it change if I applied one or more of the biggest geostrategic trends that I've identified? So there's a sense in which you can experiment with a specific decision, if you like. And then I think there's also another common action, which is to say, how do I parameterize tariffs or other geostrategic sort of issues in global supply and demand models? And often the microeconomic frameworks that underpin a lot of those models actually are amenable to putting in changes in the cost of capital or changes to trade flows. And there's also opportunities to combine those with some global equilibrium modeling that tells you in broad terms, what would a higher tariff world or a more multipolar world mean for the flow of capital? And thinking about flow of capital in those models is not necessarily a kind of an outcome, but an indication of the investor appetite and of future competitiveness. And so again, I think there's a bit of a staircase here where you can go from thinking about something in an isolated way, but important way, up to something that's more integrative over time.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting, Grant. I was wondering, and thinking through that, are you seeing sort of a dispersion across companies that you're working with in terms of some kind of leading in those practices and others maybe playing a bit more of like a wait and see mode right now as they wait for some of the dust to settle?
I think there is, but there's also a dispersion in terms of the sort of decisions that each company feels that they're going to be faced with. So an interesting number to think about is the number of companies who are going to have to change fundamentally as a result of what's been happening, and a number of companies which are actually going to conclude that their model is already quite resilient. A few months ago, we did a kind of a tour of boardrooms to talk about these issues, and it was clear that some boards had concluded that actually we've had to think about this and we're probably fine, we're going to keep watching. So it's not so much about maturity, I think, Courtney, but always about matching what you must do with the decisions you need to make and the imperatives of your business model. I guess I'd return also to the comments that we made earlier, which is be careful of concluding that you're resilient to this because you haven't thought about geostrategy in a well-rounded way. And again, you can anchor on the latest news flow and say, well, we're okay for that. But have you really done a look at every continent that might influence where you want to go, might influence global GDP growth, might influence price? You've got to really make sure you've done that full review.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And as you say, if you do the full review, you may conclude that you are well positioned, or you may not. There may be some changes that need to be made. But either way, it's useful to go through that process. All right. Well, thanks, Grant. I really appreciate you joining us today. And I love that you said making geopolitics useful as well as interesting, because that's precisely the goal of this videocast series. So hopefully we were able to do that for you today. Thank you again, Grant, for joining us. And thank you all for joining this episode of Geostrategy in Action. We'll see you next time.